This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The halls of Red Plains High School in rural Oklahoma were as lifeless as the surrounding flatlands, where the wind carried dust and whispers across endless stretches of barren earth. Inside the aging building, dim fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting uneven shadows over cracked tiles and rust-stained lockers. The school was an ecosystem of quiet despair, a place where ambition was rare and cruelty thrived unchecked. Among the students who wandered its halls, one name stood out to those who sought a target for their scorn: Cara Weaver. At 14, Cara was an outsider in every sense of the word. She moved through the school like a wraith, her presence barely acknowledged except when it was time to mock her. Her lanky frame and pale complexion made her look perpetually sickly, and her sharp, angular features gave her an unapproachable, almost sinister air. Her long black hair fell in tangled strands around her face, obscuring her expression most of the time. But when people did catch a glimpse of her eyes pale green and cold, they felt a chill that lingered long after. Cara's life at school was a gauntlet of humiliation. The whispers began the moment she entered a room, and the laughter followed soon after. Her clothes, often hand-me-downs or thrift store finds, were out of place among the carefully curated wardrobes of her classmates. Her silence made her an enigma, one that others filled with rumors and ridicule. Some said she was cursed, others joked that she was planning to bring a voodoo doll to school and hex them all. No one cared enough to wonder what was really going on inside her head. Her isolation wasn't just a school phenomenon, it extended to her home life as well. Cara lived with her uncle, a surly man whose primary concerns were the next bottle of whiskey and the occasional odd job that kept the lights on. Her mother had disappeared years ago, and her father was a ghost she had never known. Her uncle's small, decaying house sat on the edge of a field that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon, a perfect metaphor for the emptiness of her life. The nights were the worst, filled with the distant howl of coyotes and the creak of the wind through the broken shutters. Inside her room, a sanctuary of chaos, Cara surrounded herself with relics of her inner world. Torn-out pages from old books were taped to the walls, their inked words a stark contrast to the peeling wallpaper. Sketches of dark, twisted shapes filled her notebooks, along with cryptic phrases scrawled in jagged handwriting. The words weren't poems or journal entries, they were fragments of thoughts, glimpses into a mind that had long since stopped trying to make sense of the world. At school, Cara had learned to navigate her tormentors with a mix of avoidance and endurance. But the bathroom, that grimy, graffiti-stained corner of the building, was the one place she couldn't escape. It was there, in the dimly lit stalls, that the bullying reached its cruelest heights. The popular girls, led by a queen bee named Brooke Harris, would corner Cara whenever they caught her alone, their sneering voices echoing off the tiles. They mocked her clothes, her hair, her silence. They threw her bag into the trash, scrawled cruel messages on the mirrors, and once even turned a bucket of mop water over her head. The boys weren't any better. They didn't tease her to her face as often, but they found other ways to torment her. They took pictures of her when she wasn't looking, editing them into grotesque memes that spread through the school like wildfire. They left obscene drawings on her locker and stole her notebooks to read aloud her private thoughts in mocking tones. Even the teachers, worn down by years of apathy and low budgets, turned a blind eye to the harassment, their own silence and unspoken complicity in the cruelty. One particular day stood out in Cara's mind, a day that would later become the seed of her transformation. It had started like any other, with her slipping into the school through the back entrance to avoid the morning crowds. She kept her head down, her bag clutched tightly to her chest, hoping to go unnoticed. But the bullies always found her. That day it was in the bathroom. Brooke and her friends had been waiting, their laughter sharp and cruel as broken glass. They surrounded Cara, their voices a cacophony of insults and taunts. Someone had stolen her sketchbook earlier that week, and now its pages were being held up for all to see. The girls giggled at her drawings, twisting their meanings into cruel jokes. When Cara tried to reach for the book, Brooke shoved her into one of the stalls, locking the door behind her. The other girls sprayed the stall with shaving cream and wrote vile insults on the door with lipstick, their laughter echoing louder with each stroke. When they finally left, Cara stayed in the stall, trembling. The words they had scrawled surrounded her, each one a dagger aimed at her fragile sense of self. Freak, loser, worthless, her breath hitched as she stared at the wall, her vision blurring with tears. In that moment, something inside her cracked, not with sorrow, but with rage. It was a quiet, smoldering anger that settled deep in her chest, feeding on years of pain and rejection. She left the bathroom that day a different person. The Cara who had walked in had been a victim, a girl who endured and survived. The Cara who walked out was something else, something colder and more dangerous. She didn't cry again after that day. Instead, she began to plan. Her mind, once chaotic and unfocused, became sharp and methodical. The whispers and laughter still followed her, but now they sounded distant, like echoes in a vast, empty space. She began researching, spending hours on the internet in the dark corner of the school library. She read about chemicals and mechanisms, about the anatomy of fear and the psychology of control. She watched videos that most would have recoiled from, dissecting them with a clinical detachment. At home, she combed through her uncle's cluttered garage, finding items she could repurpose for her growing plan. Her sketches changed too. The dark shapes she once drew now had form and purpose, blueprints for something terrible. She covered them with layers of scribbled equations and notes, her handwriting frantic but precise. She didn't think of herself as a monster, at least not yet. In her mind, she was justice. She was retribution for all the pain the world had inflicted on her, a force that would finally make them see what they had done. The bathroom, once a place of torment, became the focal point of her revenge. It was fitting, she thought, that the place where her humiliation had been at its worst would also be the stage for her reckoning. She could already see it in her mind, the terrified faces, the panicked screams, the chaos and carnage. It wouldn't just be a revenge, it would be a message. And when it was over, they would remember her name. Cara Lynn Weaver had always been invisible. But soon the world would see her. The day Cara Lynn Weaver finally broke began like so many others in her life with silence and dread. The morning light filtered through her bedroom window in pale streaks, illuminating the cluttered space that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. Her uncle had already left, his habitual absence leaving behind an empty house and the faint, sour smell of stale beer. Cara, dressed in her usual mismatched clothes, their muted colors blending her into the background as she walked the dusty road to Red Plains High School. She kept her head low, her steps heavy with the weight of what she already knew the day would bring. The bullying had reached a fever pitch in recent weeks. The taunts, once whispered and sporadic, had become constant and bold. No corner of the school felt safe, no moment free of judgment. It wasn't just the popular kids anymore, the mocking laughter had become a chorus that included nearly everyone. Even the younger students felt emboldened to sneer at her as she passed, embers feeding a fire that had smoldered in her chest for as long as she could remember. Cara had always endured, letting their words wash over her like acid rain, but something had shifted inside her recently. The pain had changed. It no longer felt like an assault, it felt like fuel. That morning, the whispers began before she even reached her locker. A group of girls huddled nearby, their eyes darting toward her as they stifled laughter. Cara didn't need to hear their words to know they were about her. She could feel their mockery, sharp and cutting, as though it were a physical thing. Her face remained impassive, but her hands trembled as she opened her locker. Inside, she found the first of many humiliations awaiting her that day. Someone had stuffed it with garbage, crumpled paper, candy wrappers, and even a soggy piece of lunch meat that reeked of decay. On the inside of the locker door, scrawled in marker, were the words, "Go kill yourself, freak." Cara stood there for a moment, staring at the words. Her heart beat faster, her chest tightening with a mix of anger and shame. She quickly cleared the trash, stuffing it into her bag so she wouldn't have to face the janitor's judgmental glare. Around her, the hall buzzed with activity, the sound of lockers slamming and voices echoing down the corridor. No one offered her a second glance, except for the occasional smirk or sneer. She was an object, a target, something to be mocked and discarded. The day's classes passed in a blur of muted voices and pointed glances. Teachers barely acknowledged her presence, their eyes sweeping over her as though she were invisible. Cara kept her head down, doodling in her notebook, sketching dark shapes and chaotic lines that mirrored the storm brewing inside her. By lunchtime, her nerves were frayed, her hands clenched into fists beneath the table as she ate alone in the corner of the cafeteria. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the sidelong glances, the muffled laughter. Her chest burned, her pulse quickened, and she found herself gripping her fork so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Then came the bathroom incident. Cara had tried to avoid it, but nature called, and there was no other choice. The bathrooms at Red Plains High were infamous for their filth and graffiti, but to Cara, they were war zones. She entered cautiously, her eyes scanning for signs of life, but the place seemed empty. She stepped into a stall, locking the door behind her, and tried to finish as quickly as possible. That's when she heard the door creak open, the sound of voices echoing off the tiled walls. Brooke Harris and her friends. Cara recognized their voices instantly, their high-pitched laughter like nails on a chalkboard. She froze, hoping they wouldn't notice her, but the universe wasn't so kind. Brooke's voice called out, her words dripping with mockery, and Cara's heart sank. The lock on her stall rattled as Brooke jiggled it, laughing when it held firm. Another girl crouched to look under the door, her taunting voice confirming Cara's presence. The humiliation that followed was swift and brutal. They threw wet toilet paper over the stall door, the soggy wads splattering against the walls and Cara's hair. They sprayed perfume into the stall, choking her with its sickly sweet scent. And then one of them climbed onto the neighboring toilet to peer down at her. Brooke's sneering face appeared above the stall, her phone in hand, snapping pictures of Cara as she cowered below. The flash was blinding, and Cara's chest tightened with panic as she imagined the photos spreading through the school. When they finally left, their laughter echoing in the hallway, Cara remained in the stall, her entire body trembling. Her clothes were damp and reeked of the cheap perfume, her hair plastered to her forehead. She tried to breathe, but the air felt thick and suffocating. Her gaze fell to the graffiti-covered walls of the stall, and her eyes landed on the word they had scrawled in lipstick before they left Freak. The word burned itself into her mind, a symbol of everything she had endured. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms until they drew blood. Tears streamed down her face, but she wasn't crying out of sadness. She was crying out of rage. Her vision blurred as she reached into her bag, pulling out a small pocket knife she had stolen from her uncle's toolbox. She pressed the blade to her forearm, carving the words "no more" into her skin. Blood beaded along the shallow cuts, the pain sharp but grounding. It was a declaration, a promise to herself that the torment would end. When she left the bathroom, her expression was eerily calm. She walked the halls as though in a trance, her steps slow and deliberate. The laughter still followed her, but she no longer heard it. The world had narrowed to a single point of focus: revenge. Cara knew what she needed to do. The plan had already begun to take shape in her mind, each step falling into place with chilling clarity. That night, Cara sat alone in her room, her hands still stained with dried blood. She opened her notebook, flipping past the chaotic sketches until she found a blank page. With deliberate strokes, she began to draw, her pen carving out the blueprint of her plan. The bathroom, the students, the tools she would need, it all came together with a precision that surprised even her. She didn't feel fear or hesitation. She felt power. For the first time in her life, Cara Lynn Weaver was in control. The breaking point had come, and the girl who had endured so much was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who would make them pay for every cruel word, every act of humiliation. The school would remember her, not as a victim, but as the force that shattered their lives. The plan took shape in Cara's mind with the clarity of a blueprint etched in fire. It wasn't born from haste or impulse, but from the cold, calculating silence of her nights spent alone. Each detail crystallized, every step falling into place like the ticking gears of a dark, relentless machine. She understood that what she was about to do could never be undone, but the thought didn't deter her. If anything, it gave her a sense of control she'd never felt before. The mocking laughter and cruel whispers that had haunted her for so long were now distant echoes. She would silence them forever. Cara began her preparations methodically, her cold resolve guiding her every move. She needed tools, materials, and time, and she knew how to acquire them without drawing attention. Her uncle, perpetually drunk and oblivious to her existence, had a cluttered garage full of neglected equipment, rusted tools, half-empty cans of paint thinner, and boxes of forgotten odds and ends were her treasure trove. She spent hours rummaging through the chaos, selecting what she needed and hiding it under her bed. One night, she found an old metal toolbox in the corner of the garage, its contents a mix of screws, nails, and other small hardware. Among them was a handful of razor blades, still sharp despite their age. She pocketed them, their cold edges pressing against her skin as she walked back to her room. She imagined their uses, envisioned the panic they would inspire, and felt a flicker of satisfaction. The plan required more than just tools. Cara needed something that would ensure her victims were confined, helpless, and unable to escape. She began studying the school's layout in her mind, recalling every hallway, door, and window. The bathroom where she had suffered her worst humiliation became the centerpiece of her plan. Its heavy, graffiti-covered door could be locked from the inside if she wedged it properly, and its narrow windows were too high for anyone to climb through quickly. It was perfect a cage for her tormentors. But Cara's imagination didn't stop at physical barriers. She wanted to instill fear before the end came, to make them feel as powerless and insignificant as she had felt. She began experimenting with the materials she had stolen, combining them in small, controlled tests late at night. Using cleaning chemicals from under the sink and a collection of discarded bottles, she created crude smoke bombs that would release thick, choking clouds when ignited. They weren't deadly, but they would disorient and terrify, turning the cramped bathroom into a suffocating trap. Her most dangerous acquisition came from her uncle's bedroom, where a rusty gun sat hidden under a pile of dirty clothes. She had seen it once before, years ago, when he drunkenly waved it around during a tirade about someone who owed him money. Cara had avoided it then, afraid of its power, but now she saw it as a tool and equalizer. The revolver was old, its barrel slightly pitted with rust, but when she opened the cylinder she found 5 bullets still intact. She took it, careful to avoid making a sound, and hid it in the depths of her backpack. Cara spent the following days fine-tuning her plan. She chose a Friday, the last day of the school week, when tensions were high and distractions were few. She knew that Brooke Harris and her clique would gather in the bathroom during lunch, their laughter echoing down the hallways like a siren call to torment. It was their routine, their unspoken claim to that space as their territory. Cara would use their arrogance against them. She crafted a note to lure them all inside, her handwriting deliberately shaky to mimic that of a scared freshman. It promised secrets, gossip about a teacher, and the potential for another cruel prank to add to their collection. She slipped the note into Brooke's locker during a quiet moment, knowing it would spread among the group like wildfire. Brooke's curiosity and thirst for dominance would ensure they all showed up. On the morning of the chosen day, Cara's movements were mechanical, her face expressionless, as she executed the final steps of her plan. She arrived at school earlier than usual, slipping into the bathroom before anyone else could claim it. From her bag, she pulled the materials she had prepared: the smoke bombs, the revolver, and a collection of heavy-duty zip ties she'd found in the garage. She placed them carefully, ensuring they were within reach when the time came. She tested the lock on the bathroom door, jamming it with a piece of broken wood she'd shaved down to fit snugly into the mechanism. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would buy her enough time. She scattered the smoke bombs around the edges of the room, their small wicks coiled and ready. The zip ties she kept in her pocket, their plastic edges sharp and unyielding. As the first students began to arrive, Cara retreated into the farthest stall, her breathing steady and controlled. She sat on the closed toilet lid, the revolver resting on her lap, and waited. The sounds of the school waking up around her felt distant, muffled by the pounding of her heart. She didn't feel fear, only a cold, implacable certainty. When the bell for lunch finally rang, Cara tensed, her ears straining to catch the sound of footsteps. They came soon enough, the clatter of shoes against the tiled floor accompanied by the familiar shrill voices of Brooke and her friends. They entered the bathroom in a burst of noise and energy, their laughter grating and cruel. Cara heard them spreading out, inspecting the stalls and the mirrors, their conversation laced with anticipation as they mentioned the note. Cara gripped the revolver, her fingers tightening around its handle. She could hear every detail of their movements: the squeak of sneakers, the rustle of clothes, the scrape of a nail against the graffiti-covered wall. They were so confident, so oblivious to the trap they had walked into. The moment they were all inside, Cara stood, her footsteps deliberate as she emerged from the stall. The laughter stopped abruptly as they turned to see her, their faces twisting in confusion and then fear. Cara locked the door behind her, the piece of wood jamming into place with a satisfying thunk. She met their gazes, her expression blank, and raised the revolver. The plan had begun. The bathroom, once a grimy haven for idle gossip and casual cruelty, transformed into a chamber of terror in an instant. The heavy slam of the door echoed through the small space as Cara Lynn Weaver jammed the makeshift wooden wedge into the lock, sealing her victims inside. The girls, who seconds ago had been laughing and teasing, now froze in shock, their faces pale with confusion and the first stirrings of fear. The air seemed to grow heavier as Cara stood there, unmoving, her pale green eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made their stomachs churn. In her hand, the revolver gleamed dully, its rusted surface betraying its age but not its deadly purpose. For a moment, the room was suffocatingly silent, the only sounds the faint hum of the school's outdated ventilation system and the nervous shifting of the girls. Then the first smoke bomb went off. Cara had timed it perfectly. The small, hissing device she had planted near the far wall released a plume of thick, acrid smoke that spread rapidly, stinging eyes and filling lungs with a choking bitterness. The girls screamed and coughed, their panic rising as the bathroom's already limited visibility was reduced to a swirling gray haze. Cara stepped forward through the smoke, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't rushed. This was her moment, the culmination of everything she had endured. The revolver was steady in her hand, its weight grounding her as she closed the distance between herself and the first girl. Brooke Harris, the ringleader of the group, stood paralyzed, her bravado stripped away by the realization of what was happening. Cara raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the confined space, a sharp, concussive crack that reverberated off the tiled walls. Blood sprayed across the cracked mirror behind Brooke, droplets mingling with the graffiti and smudged fingerprints that already marred its surface. Brooke crumpled to the floor, her body collapsing like a marionette with its strings cut. Her friends screamed louder, their terror amplifying as they scrambled toward the corners of the bathroom, clawing at the locked door and shouting for help. But no one could hear them. Cara had chosen this location not just for its symbolism but for its isolation. The thick cinderblock walls and heavy door muffled sound, and the smoke that now choked the room would obscure any view from the narrow, grimy window near the ceiling. Cara moved with an eerie calm, her breathing steady as she approached her next target. Another girl, Jessica Myers, had fallen to her knees, her hands pressed over her mouth as she sobbed uncontrollably. Cara didn't hesitate. Another pull of the trigger, another explosion of sound, and Jessica collapsed beside Brooke, her blood pooling across the grimy floor. The smell of copper and gunpowder mingled with the acrid smoke, creating a nauseating miasma that filled the small space. The remaining girls were no longer thinking rationally. They clawed at the walls, tearing their nails against the tiles, their panicked minds searching for an escape that didn't exist. One of them, Megan Lee, attempted to crawl under the stall divider, her slim frame wriggling through the narrow gap. Cara watched her for a moment, her head tilting slightly as if considering whether to let her go. Then she stepped forward and grabbed Megan by the ankle, dragging her back into the center of the room. The girl screamed, kicking wildly, but Cara's grip was unrelenting. She raised the revolver again, the barrel now smeared with blood and smoke residue, and fired. The screams of the remaining girls grew frantic, their voices raw and ragged. Cara could hear them pleading, their words garbled by their terror and the smoke that filled their lungs. But their cries didn't move her. She had no empathy left for these people, no sympathy for the ones who had pushed her to this point. They had made her life a living hell, and now she was returning the favor. One of the girls, Dylan Ray, managed to grab one of the smoke bombs, its metal casing still warm from its chemical reaction. She hurled it at Cara, the object striking her shoulder before clattering to the floor. The impact didn't faze her, but it left a smear of black soot on her hoodie, a reminder that her victims still had some fight left in them. Cara leveled the revolver at Dylan and fired twice in quick succession. The bullets tore through her chest, and she crumpled against the stalls, her head lolling to the side as blood trickled from her mouth. The smoke grew thicker, swirling in chaotic eddies as the girl's frantic movements disturbed the air. Cara's own lungs burned, her eyes watering as she blinked against the haze. But she didn't stop. She moved methodically, her steps purposeful as she hunted down the remaining girls, one by one. The revolver's cylinder clicked empty, and she calmly discarded it, reaching into her pocket for the razor blades she had taken from her uncle's toolbox. The killings became more personal, more visceral. Cara used the blades with a precision that bordered on surgical, her movements efficient and unflinching. The sharp, metallic scent of blood mixed with the acrid smoke, creating an atmosphere so suffocating that even Cara had to pause to catch her breath. The tiles beneath her feet were slick now, stained red with the lives she had taken. By the time she reached the last girl, the bathroom was silent, except for the faint crackle of the dying smoke bombs and the distant hum of the ventilation system. The final victim, Sarah Green, was curled in the corner, her face streaked with tears and soot. Cara knelt beside her, her bloodied hands steady as she raised the blade one last time. Sarah didn't struggle. She didn't even scream. She simply closed her eyes, her body trembling as Cara ended her life with a single, decisive stroke. When it was over, Cara stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the bodies of the 10 girls who had tormented her. The bathroom was unrecognizable, its walls smeared with blood and its air thick with smoke and death. Cara's clothes were soaked through, her hands stained red, but her expression remained eerily calm. She turned to the mirror, wiping away some of the grime with her sleeve, and stared at her reflection. For the first time, she saw herself not as a victim, but as something else entirely, something powerful, something unstoppable. Her pale green eyes, rimmed with red from the smoke, stared back at her with an intensity that felt almost inhuman. She raised one bloodied hand to the mirror and wrote 2 words in shaky, dripping letters: no more. Cara sat down on the cold, wet tiles, her back against the wall. She closed her eyes, her breathing slowing as the adrenaline began to fade. The school beyond the bathroom walls continued on, blissfully unaware of the carnage inside. But Cara knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The silence wouldn't last. Soon the world would know what she had done, and they would remember her name. The bathroom of Red Plains High School became a tomb in the hours after Cara Lynn Weaver's bloody rampage. By the time the first responders arrived, drawn by the muffled cries of distant students who had fled at the sound of faint, fragmented gunshots, the school was in chaos. The faint scent of smoke had lingered in the air outside the bathroom, but no one could have anticipated the horrors that lay within. The janitor was the first to approach, his trembling hands fumbling with the keys as he tried to unlock the door. The wedge Cara had used to seal it in place had to be kicked free, and when the door finally swung open, it revealed a scene so grotesque and overwhelming that he stumbled back, vomiting onto the hallway floor. The officers who rushed in behind him were no less affected. The bathroom's confined space had become a hellscape of blood, smoke, and lifeless bodies. The tiled floor was slick with red, the walls smeared with streaks of crimson and soot. The smell was unbearable, a nauseating blend of gunpowder, chemicals, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. The bodies were scattered in unnatural positions, their limbs bent at angles that betrayed their final, desperate struggles. The once colorful graffiti on the walls now served as a backdrop to the macabre scene, the words no more scrawled across the mirror in a chilling testament to Cara's rage. The officers stepped carefully through the room, their boots leaving crimson footprints as they surveyed the carnage. In the far corner, Cara sat slumped against the wall, her face pale but eerily calm. Her hands rested limply on her lap, still streaked with dried blood, and her clothes were soaked through, dark and heavy with the evidence of her actions. Her green eyes, glassy and distant, stared straight ahead as if she were seeing something beyond the room. The revolver lay discarded on the floor beside her, its cylinder empty and coated in grime. Cara offered no resistance as the officers approached her. Her body was eerily still, her breathing shallow but steady. She didn't flinch as they cuffed her wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin. She didn't speak or struggle as they lifted her to her feet and led her out of the bathroom, her footsteps leaving faint red smudges behind. The students who had gathered in the hall recoiled at the sight of her, their faces pale with a mix of horror and disbelief. Cara didn't meet their eyes. The news of the massacre spread like wildfire, reaching the far corners of the country before the blood had even dried. Red Plains High School became the epicenter of a media frenzy, reporters descending upon the small Oklahoma town in droves. They parked their vans along the dusty streets, their cameras trained on the school's peeling facade as they delivered grim updates to a horrified audience. The story dominated the airwaves, every detail dissected and debated by anchors and pundits who struggled to make sense of the unimaginable. The parents of the victims arrived at the school in waves, their faces etched with panic and desperation. The screams and wails of mothers and fathers echoed through the halls as they were told the fate of their children. Some collapsed to their knees, their bodies shaking with grief, while others stood frozen, their faces blank with shock. The gymnasium was converted into a makeshift grief center, where counselors and clergy offered hollow words of comfort to families whose lives had been irrevocably shattered. The survivors, those who hadn't been in the bathroom at the time of the attack, were left to grapple with their own trauma. They huddled in groups, whispering among themselves as they tried to process what they had seen and heard. The rumors spread quickly, each more exaggerated than the last. Cara had killed 20 people. Cara had set the school on fire. Cara had left a manifesto detailing her reasons. The truth, when it emerged, was no less horrifying. The authorities quickly pieced together the events leading up to the massacre. The revolver was traced back to Cara's uncle, who had reported it missing only after being confronted by the police. The crude smoke bombs and razor blades were cataloged as evidence, their simplicity belying the devastation they had caused. Cara's notebooks, filled with sketches and fragmented thoughts, were found in her bedroom, their pages a chilling window into her fractured mind. The phrase "no more" appeared repeatedly, scrawled in jagged, uneven letters that grew more chaotic as the pages went on. The autopsies of the victims revealed the extent of their suffering. Bullet wounds, deep lacerations, and signs of asphyxiation told a story of unimaginable violence. The coroner's reports painted a grim picture, one that would haunt the families for the rest of their lives. The media seized upon these details, broadcasting them to an audience hungry for every gruesome fact. The victims' names and faces were plastered across screens and newspapers, their lives reduced to sound bites and headlines. Cara's arrest and subsequent trial became a national spectacle. The courtroom was packed with journalists, families and spectators eager to witness the girl who had committed such an atrocity. Cara herself remained a silent, stoic figure throughout the proceedings, her expression unreadable as the prosecution laid out their case. Psychologists and criminologists were called to testify, each offering their theories about what had driven her to kill. Some painted her as a victim, a product of relentless bullying and neglect. Others saw her as a monster, an embodiment of pure malice. The town of Red Plains became a symbol of tragedy, its name synonymous with the massacre. The school struggled to recover, its enrollment numbers dwindling as families moved away, unwilling to let their children walk the same halls where so much blood had been spilled. The bathroom where the murders occurred was sealed off, its door chained and padlocked, a grim reminder of what had happened. Students whispered that it was haunted, that the bloodstains had seeped into the tiles and could never be scrubbed away. Cara's name became infamous, a rallying cry for debates about bullying, mental health, and school safety. Politicians invoked her story to push their agendas, and activists used it to highlight the failures of the system. But for those who knew her or thought they did, the horror was more personal. Teachers who had ignored her silence now wondered if they could have done something to stop her. Classmates who had mocked her now carried the weight of guilt, their cruelty laid bare in the aftermath of her actions. In her final court appearance, Cara was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As she was led away in chains, she remained silent, her gaze fixed straight ahead. The families of her victims watched her go, their faces etched with grief and fury, but Cara didn't look back. In the years that followed, the story of Cara Lynn Weaver faded from the headlines, replaced by new tragedies and scandals. But for those who lived through it, the memory remained fresh, a wound that refused to heal. The town of Red Plains became a shadow of its former self, its streets quieter, its people more cautious. And in the depths of a high-security prison, Cara sat alone in her cell, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her pale green eyes staring at the wall. The world had tried to forget her, but she knew they never truly would. No more was etched into their collective memory, a permanent scar left by a girl no one had bothered to save. In the years that followed the Red Plains High School massacre, the echoes of Cara Lynn Weaver's actions rippled outward, haunting the town, the survivors, and the collective consciousness of a nation. Red Plains, once a nondescript dot on the map of Oklahoma, became synonymous with one of the most chilling acts of violence ever committed by a child. The massacre had not just stolen lives, it had permanently altered the fabric of the town, the school, and everyone connected to it. The school itself never recovered. Despite attempts at renovation and rebranding, the events of that day lingered like a specter, woven into the building's very structure. The bathroom where the murders had occurred remained sealed for months after the investigation, the bloodstains and damage left untouched while the authorities argued over what to do with it. Eventually, it was gutted entirely, the tiles replaced and the stalls torn out, but the effort did little to erase the memory of what had happened there. Students whispered that they could still smell smoke and blood when they walked by, that they could hear faint cries late at night when the halls were empty. Whether these were the imaginings of traumatized minds or the beginnings of a grim legend didn't matter. The school became a place of fear and avoidance, its reputation irreparably stained. Attendance plummeted as families fled the town, unwilling to let their children walk the same halls where their friends and classmates had died. Teachers quit in droves, unable to bear the weight of their guilt or the oppressive atmosphere that hung over the campus. The administration brought in counselors and security measures, but it wasn't enough. Red Plains High became a hollow shell, its remaining students walking its halls like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn. Within 5 years, the school was shuttered entirely, its doors chained shut and its windows boarded over. The town of Red Plains fared no better. It became a magnet for reporters, curiosity seekers, and true crime enthusiasts, all drawn to the site of the massacre like vultures to a carcass. For a time, the influx of outsiders brought a strange, morbid tourism that filled local motels and diners. But the attention came at a cost. The constant presence of cameras and strangers reminded the townspeople of their grief, preventing them from moving on. Businesses closed as the economy faltered, and the population dwindled as more and more families moved away, unwilling to remain in a place so deeply scarred by tragedy. The survivors of the massacre carried their own burdens. Those who had escaped death that day found themselves trapped in a different kind of prison, haunted by memories of the screams, the blood, and the blank expression on Cara's face as she carried out her plan. They struggled with survivors' guilt, questioning why they had been spared when others hadn't. Therapy sessions became a grim routine, but no amount of counseling could erase the images burned into their minds. Some of the survivors turned their pain into activism, speaking out against bullying and advocating for better mental health support in schools. They appeared on television and at conferences, their voices trembling as they recounted their experiences in the hope of preventing another tragedy. Others withdrew from the world, unable to face the memories that surfaced every time they closed their eyes. A few tried to go on as if nothing had happened, but the weight of what they had witnessed always found its way back to them, dragging them into a darkness they could never fully escape. Cara herself became a symbol, her name whispered with a mix of fear, revulsion, and morbid fascination. Her trial had captivated the nation, her stoic silence in the courtroom becoming one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Some saw her as a monster, the embodiment of cold, calculated evil. Others viewed her as a victim, a product of relentless bullying and neglect, who had been pushed to the breaking point. Psychologists and criminologists debated her motives endlessly, dissecting her notebooks and behavior in an attempt to understand what had driven her to kill. In prison, Cara remained as silent and inscrutable as ever. She refused interviews and rarely spoke to the guards or other inmates. Her time was spent reading, sketching, and staring at the walls of her cell, her pale green eyes distant and unreadable. She became a ghost within the prison, her presence barely acknowledged except when absolutely necessary. Even among hardened criminals, her crime was viewed with a mix of disgust and unease. The other inmates gave her a wide berth, their whispered conversations filled with speculation about the quiet girl who had murdered 10 of her classmates. Despite her silence, Cara's actions continued to reverberate far beyond the prison walls. Her name became a rallying cry for debates about school violence, mental health, and the failures of the educational system. Politicians invoked her story to push their agendas, whether calling for stricter gun control or harsher punishments for juvenile offenders. Activists on both sides of the bullying debate used her as a symbol, twisting her actions to suit their narratives. Her name was immortalized in documentaries, books, and podcasts, each one claiming to reveal the truth behind the Red Plains massacre. But the truth was something no one could fully grasp. Cara's notebooks provided glimpses into her mind, a chaotic swirl of anger, pain, and methodical planning, but they didn't answer the most pressing question: why? Why had she chosen that day, that moment, to unleash her rage? Why had she targeted those specific girls? Why had she spared the rest of the school? The answers died with the Cara who had walked into that bathroom, replaced by the silent figure who now inhabited a prison cell. Years passed, and the story of the Red Plains massacre began to fade from the headlines, replaced by new tragedies and scandals. The town of Red Plains became a footnote in true crime history, its name remembered only by those who had lived through its darkest days. The school building, abandoned and decaying, became a destination for urban explorers and thrill-seekers, its blood-stained history adding to its allure. Inside, the bathroom where the murders had occurred remained untouched, a chilling time capsule of that day. The graffiti had faded, the tiles were cracked, but the memories lingered, etched into the walls like scars. And in her cell, Cara Lynn Weaver continued to exist, her name a shadow that refused to dissipate. She never spoke of that day, never expressed regret or justification. The world outside moved on, but for Cara, time stood still. She sat on the edge of her cot, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her pale green eyes fixed on a distant point only she could see. The words she had scrawled on the mirror that day no more remained her only statement, a chilling reminder of the silence that had surrounded her for so long.